This is the second video on writing for print journalism. And we're going to go over some common news story topics and then have a bit of advice from Anne Handley and Everybody Writes as a way to approach thinking about structuring your sentences, paragraphs, etc. within a news story. So, what do we mean by news story? It's something that we might take for granted that we know kind of the definition of. So common things you might cover if you're covering a news story are meetings, speeches, obituaries, weather stories like our snow day today, crime courtroom stories, and periodical or anniversary stories. So, for example, you're covering a meeting. And all of these things you'd cover in a lot more detail when you take journalism. So I do want to just review for those of you who have taken journalism and give a very brief overview for those of you who haven't. More detail, obviously, in your book and in journalism. So meetings, you would cover governmental and quasi-governmental bodies. By that, we mean anyone that has some kind of government structure. Student government organizations, for example, have a quasi-governmental structure. So anything where you have meetings, you've got that. So you can think about things in your community, and these can also be nonprofits. These can be, again, if you're meeting around a cause, or, if you are meeting around a group within, again, things like our Yellow Jacket newspaper, or you're going and you're in some club within the school. So if there is a meeting, what happens? So you want to emphasize the most important actions and, of course, things that are dramatic and unexpected. You need to also cover the mundane, but to make it interesting, if there's a big topic that's something that a lot of people are going to care about, make sure you emphasize that. Speeches, you want to accurately reflect what the person said, but you want to do it in an interesting and coherent way. So your paragraph that you lead off with at the beginning, it's always going to contain the most important things said. So you want to make sure that, again, it's not just a transcript, but that you're picking it out for sense. What is the heart of the speech? And then you're not going to show it chronologically, but you're going to break it up according to importance. You'll mix in direct quotes, so those are things within quotation marks that you cannot change at all in terms of the wording or what was said. Indirect quotes where you paraphrase certain sections. So again, this is not a transcript. And you can add in a setting and let people know a bit about what's going on around the speech. So are there a lot of people there, a few people there, etc. Obituaries, you're usually only going to be writing them if they're for prominent or interesting people. So people within your community or within the wider world who have contributed to society. And you're going to note their accomplishments, their personal characteristics. But you also want to make sure, again, that it's balanced. You're not just writing a nice elegy that someone's going to read at their funeral. You also want to note they're a accurate representation of their contribution. So even if there is some negative things, it is your job to speak ill of the dead in that case. You want to mention the impact on family members, maybe interview them, get some quotes, and also make sure you put in the details that people will want to know, such as the time and place of funeral or memorial services, and information about sending memorial contributions. Now, weather stories tend to be, again, not something you'd write every day, but if there's a significant event, like a snow day. If there is a severe weather story, are there deaths, injuries, property damage? What is the impact on your community? And think about things that are long term. Again, we look at how the climate is changing. That's a weather story as well. Now, crime and courtroom stories might be what we think of most when we think of news. Now, we're going to rely on news values, which means ethics around how we cover crime and courtroom stories. Again, we're not going to presume guilt. We're going to make sure that we show the facts and we do it in an impartial way. Now, we are also writing in a way that's interesting and entertaining. So you want to make sure that you mention the conflict that's happening so that people understand it's not just dry. Again, it's not a transcript of courtroom proceedings. But you also want to mention the impact. How does this impact your community? When you're writing for an audience, what does the audience want to know? Is there something unusual about the story? That can also be a reason to pull it out. Or maybe it's something that's typical, and the fact that it is typical, it's what's important. This is happening a lot in our community. Now, what do we mean by periodical stories? Anniversary stories is probably an easier way for most of us to understand it. Things that happen periodically. Things that are tied to the calendar. And one of the things that's important is to not just post the same story every year on the anniversary of something happening, but provide fresh information. How have things changed? Have we looked back on, say, the legacy of someone, and in retrospect, their impact is actually different from what we thought it was at first? Maybe in the moment, people are focusing on the wrong thing. So make sure that it's fresh and interesting and that people will want to read it. Now, I'm just going to end with a tip from Anne Handley's Everybody Writes. And that is about how structurally we're going to look at putting together our sentences and our sentences within our paragraphs for these news stories. Now, as she says, it might sound remedial to say that each sentence should begin with a subject and verb, but it's the easiest way to buff up bad writing to make it more appealing. Again, the thing about news writing is that you are always going in descending order of importance, which means the most important thing needs to go to the top. And that's true within your sentence as much as it's true within the story as a whole. So she says the first word of every sentence should make a friendly first impression to encourage the reader to keep going, much the way a favorable first impression at a party encourages conversations, as opposed to, say, desperate glances around the room to find some other opportunity. So remember that you want to invite the reader into your sentences. These sentences want to invite your reader into reading more, and make sure that we do not waste their time and we give them the most important information up front. Now, here's an example that she pulled out, which is kind of interesting given the content. So this is a quote from a piece that was released. According to the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, NAAL, released in 2006 by the U.S. Department of Education, 30 million adults struggle with basic reading tasks. Now, if you think about that sentence, there's a lot. And at the beginning, it's placing the emphasis on the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, that governing body. But is that what's most important about the sentence? She and I agree that, in fact, the most important part is that 30 million adults struggle reading. And so if that's the most important bit, how can you restructure that sentence in order to get that to the reader first? So here's how she proposes it should be written. 30 million adults struggle with reading, according to the National Assessment of Adult Literacy report released in 2006 by the U.S. Department of Education. And in here we're saying 30 million adults struggle. Here's who said it. So do we think that's important? And when was it released? Is it an old fact or a new fact? And so I think that's a better way of approaching it. And to remember, again, you get your ideas down on paper, but when you go to edit and rewrite for sense, make sure that you think about what is the most important thing. And when we're writing anything journalistic, and especially if it's news, you want to make sure that you put that at the heart of what you're doing.